2 weeks ago, my son moved into his new house. I decided to bring them a housewarming gift. But just as I reached the door, his neighbor ran out and shouted, "Don't go in! I have to tell you something." 5 minutes later, the police arrived. But before I continue, check if you've already subscribed to the channel and share in the comments where you are watching us from. We would love to know how far our revenge stories reach. I am Carol. I am 65 years old. Today, I came to visit my son and his wife. I handed the driver a few dollars, smiled my thanks, and asked him to reach for the white orchid I had carefully placed in the back seat. It wasn't just a housewarming gift. It was also my hope, a wish for good beginnings for my son, Robert, and his wife, Amelia, after so many storms. I got out of the car and took a deep breath. In front of me was their new house, a 2-story home, painted in a soft cream tone, with a white picket fence and a small lawn out front. I felt a deep warmth in my chest. The pot in my hands seemed heavier, as if it contained all my dreams. I was about to push the wooden door, which still smelled of fresh paint, when a man from the house across the street, an elderly gentleman dressed in worn gardening clothes, ran toward me. He looked agitated, his face full of wrinkles marked by worry, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool weather. "Stop, ma'am, don't go in there." He grabbed my arm with a rough, calloused hand, gripping tightly. I was startled. He was breathing heavily. "Don't go in. I have something urgent to tell you." I froze, not understanding what was happening, not even getting a chance to ask him who he was, when a police cruiser pulled up silently in front of the house. The blue and red lights flashed without the siren sounding, filling the quiet neighborhood with a strange tension. 2 tall officers stepped out of the vehicle, their faces serious. The older man immediately released me and turned to them, as if he had just found a lifeline. He pointed to my son's house with a firm voice. "I already told you, I swear. I heard a child crying from inside there." One of the police officers approached me, observing me carefully. "Ma'am, are you a relative of the homeowner?" I nodded, confused, my heart beating restlessly. What the heck was going on? The neighbor immediately turned to me, still agitated. "I'm Mr. Henderson, Robert and his wife's neighbor. These past few days, I've heard a child crying, soft but constant, coming from their house. But I know perfectly well that they don't have children. I told myself maybe it was my imagination, that I'm old and hearing things. But this morning, the crying was heartbreaking. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to ring the doorbell. I knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. I was afraid something bad had happened. That's why I called the police. Every word from Mr. Henderson chilled me further inside. I shook my head, trying to calm him, and perhaps to calm myself. I smiled weakly. "You must have heard wrong. Maybe it was the television or some stray cat in the yard. My son and his wife don't have small children." I said the last sentence firmly, like an indisputable truth, because more than anyone, I knew the pain they had suffered. But right at that moment, a whimpering sound broke all my attempts at justification. A muffled cry, weak but full of hurt, echoed from inside the house. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the morning, it sounded clear, like an icy needle piercing directly into my chest. It wasn't the television, nor a cat. It was, without a doubt, the cry of a child. I stood motionless. I felt the blood stop running through my veins. My back went cold, and the pot in my hands felt like a stone. The 2 police officers didn't waste a second. They quickly communicated over the radio, and one of them went straight to the front door. He raised his hand and knocked on the wood with his knuckles. The dry sound echoed in the air. "Police! Open the door!" Silence was the only answer. "Police! Open immediately, he repeated, his voice stronger and firmer. Still no response, only the sobs, lower now, broken and full of fear. After several failed attempts to call, the officer in command gave a signal. The other took a lock-picking tool from the patrol car. A dry snap echoed in the air. The bolt broke. The door burst open. One of the police officers unholstered his weapon and entered cautiously, while the other remained on guard at the entrance. Mr. Henderson and I remained paralyzed, holding our breath. Every second passed slowly like a century. My mind was blank. I could only hear the frantic pounding of my heart within my chest. And then, a few seconds later, a voice shouted from deep within the house. "The crying is coming from the basement." The basement! Those two words were like a hammer blow to my head. My hands went slack. The pot with the white orchids slipped from my grasp and fell onto the concrete ground with a shattering crash. Dirt scattered everywhere. The white petals, once pure, were dirty and crushed. The symbol of my hope and a new beginning was nothing but ruins. That shattering sound seemed to tear down a wall in my mind, pulling me out of that terrifying reality and sinking me into a distant corner of my memories. A place where the image of Amelia, my daughter-in-law, appeared clear and sweet as a dream. I was a widow, and alone, I strived to raise Robert, my only son, until he was a man. My life passed quietly and somewhat solitarily until the day he introduced her to me. I remember that afternoon perfectly. The girl hid shyly behind Robert. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, her eyes large and clear as an autumn lake, with a touch of shyness but full of warmth. And then she smiled, a smile capable of dispelling any sadness. In that instant, I knew I would love her like a daughter. She stepped forward, clasped her hands respectfully over her chest, and said in a soft, sincere voice, "Good afternoon, Mum." That word, Mum, so sweet and heartfelt, filled the emptiness that had resided in me for so many years. Since then, my house once again had laughter, meals prepared with care, and one more daughter to look after and love. Their wedding was celebrated on an autumn day, under a sun as golden as honey. When giving her the wedding gift, I took her small hand and slipped onto it. The jade bracelet that had belonged to my mother, a pure and fresh green. I looked into her eyes and said, "From today on, you are not only Robert's wife, you are also my daughter." Amelia didn't answer. She just hugged me. Her fragile body trembled, and I felt her hot tears soaking my shoulder. A year later, during a family dinner, Robert was smiling mysteriously. He handed me a small box with a ribbon. I opened it curiously, and what was inside left me speechless. Tiny knitted white wool booties adorned with a blue ribbon. When I looked up, I saw my two children looking at me with hope. Amelia nodded gently, placing a hand on her belly with tenderness. At that moment, I burst into tears. Not of sadness, but of happiness. A happiness I had waited a lifetime for. The following months were the happiest. I took out my old balls of yarn and began knitting, stitch by stitch, little sweaters, hats, and mittens for my future grandchild. Amelia came often. She snuggled on my lap, stroked her already round belly, and laughed, saying, "Mom, it kicked again. He's definitely going to be a mischief maker." Together we painted the old room, hung white clouds and shining stars, preparing everything to welcome our little angel. But the day that Angel arrived in the world was also the day the gates of hell opened. Robert and I waited in the cold metal chairs in front of the delivery room, while time dragged on, heavy as lead. The ticking of the clock on the wall became the most torturous sound of all. Nurses and doctors went in and out incessantly, their faces tense, without anyone saying a single word. My mother's instinct told me something was very wrong. Finally, after a few hours that seemed like an eternity, an older doctor came out. His face reflected a deep weariness. He looked at us with eyes full of compassion and said that Amelia had suffered a very severe hemorrhage. They had fought with all their strength to save both of them, and they had succeeded. But to save her life, we had to perform a hysterectomy. I am very sorry. His voice grew grave. She will not be able to get pregnant again. Every word was like an invisible blow that shattered the world we had just built. I looked beside me. Robert had collapsed in the chair, covering his face with both hands, his body trembling with silent sobs. I felt an iron hand squeezing my chest. The pain was so intense I could barely breathe. When they allowed us to enter, Amelia lay in bed, pale and weak. She stared intently at the ceiling with empty eyes. But then, when the nurse placed little Lily, red-faced and wrapped in a white blanket, in her arms, a miracle occurred. Amelia's face lit up. The despair disappeared, replaced by an immense love. Trembling, she stroked her daughter's cheek, leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering a sacred promise. "You are Mommy's only miracle, Lily." From that day on, Amelia dedicated her entire life to Lily. Her world narrowed to her daughter's small body. She cared for her with an almost obsessive devotion. Every breath, every movement of the child made her jump. She hardly ever separated from her. She did everything with her own hands, feeding her, bathing her, singing her to sleep. I used to visit often. I cooked nutritious meals, like chicken noodle soup and comforting meatloaf, for my daughter-in-law and helped her care for the baby. Watching Lily grow day by day, plump, beautiful, with her round cheeks and radiant smile, brought me comfort. I thought that, even though the price had been too high, the miracle called Lily would be enough to heal all the wounds, and that from then on, our family would live in peace. But that peace I thought I had recovered was as fragile as the fog at dawn, and it vanished as soon as tragedy reappeared. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen kneading dough for biscuits when the phone rang. Seeing Robert's name, I smiled, thinking of joking with him and asking if he wanted to come over for a piece. But the sound on the other end of the line made my world collapse. It wasn't his usual voice, but a broken, desperate sob. "Mom! Mom!" he called me, his voice shattered. "Lily, the child." Only those words were enough for the ground to move beneath my feet. I didn't ask anything else. I just grabbed my coat and ran out. All the way to the hospital, only my son's sobs echoed in my head. I found them in the waiting room, outside the emergency department. Robert was hunched over, his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling non-stop. And Amelia was motionless beside him, sitting upright, her hands in her lap. She wore an impeccable white dress, now stained red, like a sinister flower blooming on snow. Her eyes were fixed on the operating room door, empty, soulless. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking, as if someone had ripped the spirit from her body. Robert lifted his head, his swollen red eyes looking at me full of guilt. Between sobs, with broken words, he began to tell me. When the family was strolling through the park, Lily saw a colourful ice cream truck across the street and shouted excitedly that she wanted one. In the instant, Amelia turned around to look for her purse. Just a brief moment, like a blink, Lily's small hand slipped from her mother's. The girl ran into the street, still smiling. A large truck couldn't stop in time. Everything happened too fast, too cruel, snatching the little angel from our family. At the funeral, Amelia didn't cry. Among the choked sobs of the relatives, She just stood still next to the small white coffin, like a statue carved in ice. Her gaze no longer settled on anything, lost in a place where only she and an impossible pain existed. The following days, she shut herself in Lily's room. The room we once decorated with joy became a mausoleum of memories. She sat on the floor, hugging the child's worn teddy bear, without eating, without drinking, without speaking a word. Robert had to go back to work after 1 week. He did so with a broken heart and constant fear. Fearing that his wife would do something terrible while alone, I packed some clothes and moved in with them. I cooked soup, like a warm clam chowder, brought it to her room, and patiently fed her spoonful by spoonful, as if she were a small child. Every night I heard her choked sobs, a soul-breaking sound that came from behind the door. I would go in, hug her, let her cry on my shoulder, but I didn't say anything. Only the hot tears kept falling silently. Approximately 1 month later, when the pain seemed to have calmed down a little, I began to notice strange signs. One day while cleaning the house, I saw a receipt from a children's clothing store in the trash can. A pink princess dress, sized for a 5-year-old girl. I felt a knot in my chest. Lily died before she turned 4. When I asked her, Amelia lowered her head and mumbled that she had bought it to donate to an orphanage. Her explanation sounded reasonable, but my instinct told me something wasn't right. Until one day, the neighbor rang the doorbell. Her face showed discomfort and fear. She complained that Amelia stood by the fence, staring intently at her granddaughter as she played in the yard. That girl's look, she said, had something intense, a mixture of hunger and sadness, and it scared me. Amelia was quick to apologize, saying she just missed Lily too much. I had to speak carefully with the neighbor so that she wouldn't make a bigger deal of the matter. But the tension reached its peak late one night. Passing by Lily's room, I saw that the door was ajar and a faint light was coming from inside. I looked in curiously, and what I saw chilled my blood. Amelia was sitting in the rocking chair that Robert had bought for rocking the baby to sleep. Her arms moved gently, cradling the emptiness in front of her chest. And her lips were singing a lullaby, the same one she used to sing to Lily every night. That familiar melody, now echoing in an empty room, sounded like a ghostly echo, sad and chilling. I couldn't sleep that night. Fear was crushing my heart. At dawn, I called Robert and told him everything. At first, he dismissed it. He said I worried too much, that Amelia was just dealing with her grief in her own way. But when I mentioned the lullaby in the empty room, he was silent for a long time on the other end of the line. I held back my tears. My voice trembled. "Son, we have to take her to see a therapist. I'm afraid she can't take it anymore." At first, Amelia reacted with fury. She shouted, saying we thought she was crazy. But in the end, faced with Robert's and my pleas, she agreed to go to therapy. The following months were truly a miracle. Amelia started to look more cheerful. She came out of her room, cleaned the house, cooked delicious things like baked apple pie and barbecue ribs. There was even one day when she invited me to go shopping and picked out a new scarf for me with her own hands. I was moved to tears, silently thanking heaven for giving me back the sweet daughter-in-law I once had. I truly believed that finally, she had been strong enough to climb out of the abyss. Seeing her stable, I decided to return to my own house to give them back their private space as a couple. Before leaving, I hugged her tight and said, "If anything happens, call me immediately." She smiled, a genuine smile after so many days, and nodded. 1 month later, Robert called me on the phone. This time, his voice on the other end of the line wasn't of crying, but of joy and enthusiasm. "Mom, we moved 2 weeks ago. We found a place in the suburbs, very quiet. Amelia says the fresh air out there makes her feel better. Hearing that, my heart filled with hope. A new beginning, a new home to leave the painful memories behind. I was so happy for them that I decided to give them a surprise. I went to buy a pot of white orchids, Amelia's favourite flower, and packed it carefully to take as a housewarming gift. I didn't know that the surprise I wanted to give them, that pot full of hope, would be what would push me to cross the threshold into a hell I never could have imagined. "Ma'am, are you all right?" A worried voice pulled me out of the abyss of memories. I blinked, and the tragic image of Lily faded, leaving only the broken remains on the ground and the withered orchid petals under my feet. A young police officer was kneeling beside me. His hand carefully held my shoulder. "Can you stand up?" He helped me to my feet. My legs felt so weak, as if they had no bones. My body was trembling. I had to lean on the railing to maintain my balance. All the sounds around seemed muffled. My gaze was fixed on a single point. The basement door, wide open like a black mouth, ready to swallow everything. At that moment, the other officer came up from the basement. Each of his steps on the wooden stairs echoed with a sad, dense weight, and then he appeared fully in the light. In his arms, he carried a small girl. The girl wore a faded and old pink nightgown, her bare feet covered in dust. Her brown hair, tangled and matted, covered almost her entire face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just trembling uncontrollably in the police officer's arms. Her eyes were wide open, distraught and empty, staring straight ahead without seeing, as if she had witnessed something so terrifying that she could no longer react. In one hand, she clutched a worn stuffed bunny with one ear torn off, as if it were the only lifeline she had left in the world. A newly arrived female officer quickly approached and covered the girl's fragile little body with a light blanket. She turned to me, her voice trying to maintain professional calmness, although I could notice the tremor behind the words. "Ma'am, do you recognize this child?" I stared at the little girl's dirty face, her large eyes, her wide forehead, her small chin. I searched for any familiar feature, a spark of hope that would give a logical explanation to all of this. But no, that face was completely unknown to me. I shook my head without thinking, my throat dry, unable to utter a word. "Then, do you know why this child was in your son and daughter-in-law's house?" the officer continued. That question was like a knife thrust directly into my heart. What could I answer? I knew nothing. I could only stand there, in silence, feeling helpless and guilty for no reason. At that moment, an ambulance and another police car stopped in front of the gate, breaking the heavy silence. The officer in command signaled his team to continue searching the entire house. Minutes later, another voice echoed from the basement, firm and cold, informing his superior. "Sir, down here there's a thin mattress on the cement floor, some children's clothing, several boxes of canned food and bottles of water. There is also a plastic potty. Everything indicates that someone has been living here for quite some time." Every word he said was like an invisible punch directly to my head. Those phrases combined painted a terrifying picture of confinement, of a life deprived of sunlight. This was not an accident. It was something planned with intent. The female officer tried to talk to the girl, her voice as gentle as she could make it. "What is your name? Don't be afraid, we are going to help you." But the little girl just shook her head vigorously, hiding her face under the blanket, curled up like a wounded animal. They decided to take her to the hospital immediately to check her health and calm her down. The ambulance slowly drove away, taking the terrible newly discovered secret out of that quiet street. I stood motionless, watching the vehicle until it disappeared around the bend. My mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. A shiver ran down my spine. Trembling, I took the phone out of my purse and with numb fingers dialed Robert's number. The ringtone sounded, each beep long and slow, devouring the last spark of hope I had left. "The number you have dialed is not available." The cold voice of the voicemail cut off any attempt. My heart sank. Maybe he was in a meeting, I told myself, trying to calm down as I dialed Amelia's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. The ring continued insistently, prolonged and desperate, piercing the silence of the afternoon. I held my breath, praying that she would answer, that she would give me an explanation, even an absurd one. But after several rings, the phone shut off. No one answered. The silence from both sides of the line became unbearable, and a feeling of terror began to envelop my chest, squeezing my heart tightly. Where were they? Why wasn't either of them answering right now? And the child locked in the basement? Who was she really? The officer in command approached me and Mr. Henderson. His face no longer showed surprise, but the seriousness of someone who fears the worst. In a grave and firm voice, he said, "Ma'am, sir, we need to take your initial statements. Please sit here for a moment." He pointed to the wooden bench on the porch, the same one where I had imagined Robert and Amelia reading together. I walked unsteadily and let myself fall onto the seat. I felt as if all my energy had been drained, leaving me empty. Mr. Henderson sat beside me, his rough gardener's hands intertwined over his knees. The bench creaked slightly, with a sad, melancholy sound. A young police officer took out a notebook and a pen. He sat across from us and began questioning Mr. Henderson first. "Could you tell us in detail what you have seen and heard these past few days, sir?" The man cleared his throat, his gaze lost on the open door of the house, as if trying to piece together a strange puzzle. "It all started a little over 1 week ago, just after Robert and his wife moved in. Every night, young man, without fail. Around 10 p.m., when the whole neighborhood was already quiet, I would hear a soft lullaby coming from that house next door." "A lullaby?" the police officer repeated while writing non-stop. "Yes, a very familiar lullaby." I felt my heart stop for an instant. He continued. "It was a woman's voice, very low, barely a whisper, but since the nights here are so quiet, it was clearly audible. The melody repeated over and over. But the strange thing was that sometimes, between the song, I would hear a child's muffled cry, a contained cry that was immediately silenced, as if someone was afraid of being heard from outside. A knot formed in my throat, the familiar lullaby, the silenced crying. In my mind, the melody Amelia sang to Lily countless times began to play. A tender melody, full of love, which now, in Mr. Henderson's words, had become a sinister and disturbing sound. "A few days ago," he continued, pulling me out of my thoughts, "I saw the young man, Robert, arrive home. When he came out to the garden to water the new potted plants, I approached to say hello. I asked him directly, 'Do you have visitors? A child, perhaps?' He smiled, a tired smile, but he dismissed it. He told me, 'Of course not. You must have misheard some neighbor's TV. We don't have children.' He said it so convincingly that I chose to keep quiet. I thought maybe I'm old and hearing things that aren't there." Hearing that, a mixture of sadness and disappointment washed over me. Robert, my son, had been warned, but he dismissed it. He was so absorbed in his work, in his own problems, that he didn't realize the turmoil brewing inside his own home. But this morning, there was no longer room for doubt. Mr. Henderson's voice became firm. His eyes reflected determination. I was pruning my rose bushes when I heard a heartbreaking scream. It was a child's voice, clear and desperate. It shouted, "Help! Help!" Only 2 words, and then silence, as if someone had covered its mouth. It was at that moment that I knew I couldn't keep waiting. The young police officer looked up from his notebook. "Before that, besides the singing and the crying, did you notice anything else strange?" Mr. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, last week there was also a scream, but it was an adult's. Amelia's voice. A high-pitched scream full of fear. I was worried. I thought they were arguing, or that there was a burglar, so I asked an officer who patrols around here to go check it out." I held my breath. "She opened the door herself," he recounted. "She looked calm. She even smiled and said, 'Oh, I'm sorry for scaring you, sir. I saw a huge cockroach, and I started screaming.' She said it very naturally, but there was something odd. She stood right in the doorway. She only partially opened the door, without letting anyone see inside. Since there were no signs of trouble, the officer left." Mr. Henderson's testimony ended. I remembered that Amelia had always been terrified of insects. Her explanation sounded perfect. But now, in this context, that perfection was the most unsettling thing. It was a carefully planned lie. Mr. Henderson looked at me. His eyes no longer showed fright, but pity, understanding, and an unmovable conviction. He spoke softly, but loud enough for the police officer and me to hear him. "I know that something very strange is happening in that house, ma'am. An old man's intuition is never wrong." The officer in command politely thanked him and allowed him to leave. He nodded. He cast a look full of compassion at me and slowly crossed the street, his steps heavy. The small street returned to a terrifying silence. Only I remained, a few police officers who continued to search the place, and a horrible truth that was still hidden behind a veil of mystery. I sat alone on the porch swing. It swayed gently with the wind, emitting a sad, mournful creak, like the sigh of the house itself. Every detail of Mr. Henderson's story was stabbing into my mind like fragments of glass, sharp and painful. The lullaby, the silenced crying, the lie about the cockroach, and the desperate scream for help. Everything mingled in a chaotic whirlwind that destroyed any faith, any hope I had tried to maintain. I thought Amelia had overcome it, but maybe she never truly managed to escape the ghost of the past. She was only dragging us deeper into it. At that moment, the young police officer who had accompanied the girl to the ambulance returned. He walked quickly, with long, decisive strides, his face much more serious than before. He didn't say anything. He went straight to the officer in command who was near the door and showed him something on his tablet screen. The commander squinted. He observed attentively. I noticed a small twitch on his face before he looked up and stared directly at me. His gaze was no longer professional or distant, but a strange mixture of determination, compassion, and something that resembled a warning. He didn't say a word. He just gestured with his head for the young police officer to speak to me. The officer approached me, and each of his steps felt like a crushing weight on my chest. He stopped in front of me. He took a deep breath, seeking courage. His voice trembled slightly, as if carefully choosing the least cruel words possible. "Ma'am, we have just cross-referenced the information from the hospital." He paused. "The child found in the basement matches a report of a missing minor." My ears were ringing. All sound around me faded. I only heard the frantic pounding of my heart. "Missing?" He continued, and this time every word sounded clear, heavy, like hammer blows on my shattered soul. "The girl's name is Chloe Miller. She is 5 years old. The disappearance report was filed exactly 2 weeks ago in the city's Central Park. 2 weeks. That number pierced me like a thorn. 2 weeks. Exactly the amount of time since Robert had happily told me they had moved into this house. Exactly the amount of time that I, naively, believed they were starting a new life. But that new beginning had been built upon the end of another family. The young police officer seemed to read the horror in my eyes. He asked cautiously, trying to maintain objectivity in his voice, "Ma'am, is it true that your son and daughter-in-law moved here around that date?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt closed, as if someone was squeezing it. I could only nod faintly, an almost imperceptible movement, but as heavy as a confession. "We have contacted the girl, Chloe's biological parents," he added with a compassionate tone upon seeing my state. "They are on their way to the hospital. They have been searching for their daughter tirelessly for 2 weeks. They were on the verge of madness." Every word of his painted the tragic picture of another family more strongly, a family I didn't know, but whose destiny was now intertwined with mine by a thread of guilt and horror. After a deathly silence, the young police officer's voice became firm, solemn, charged with the full weight of the law. "Ma'am, with the evidence found at the scene and the witnesses' statements, we have sufficient grounds to issue an arrest warrant for Mrs. Amelia Vega for the crime of child kidnapping. Your son, Mr. Robert Torres, will also be summoned for questioning as an involved person, possibly as an accomplice." That phrase fell like a lightning bolt, tearing the already grey sky that weighed over my head. Arrest Amelia. Investigate Robert. Accomplice. Those words were like poisoned daggers stabbing my heart. My legs gave way. I could no longer remain sitting on the rocking chair. My entire body collapsed, falling onto the cold stone steps. The world around me began to spin, to wobble. Amelia, my sweet and kind daughter-in-law, the girl I loved so much, a kidnapper. Robert, my only son, whom I dedicated my whole life to raising and protecting. An accomplice? No, it couldn't be. A silent no screamed inside my mind. There had to be a terrible mistake, a cruel coincidence. My daughter-in-law was just a desperate mother. She couldn't have done something so monstrous. My son was just a distracted husband, not a criminal. But the faint cry of a child was real. The secret room in the basement was real. Mr. Henderson's testimony was real. And the missing little Chloe Miller was also real. I no longer knew what to believe. The evening began to fall, staining the entire neighborhood with a sad, dull orange hue. I remained sitting on the icy steps, huddled in my thin coat. And then, in the midst of that terrifying silence, a familiar engine was heard. A silver sedan slowly turned the corner. Its headlights drew a stripe of light over the white fence. It was Amelia's car. My heart began to pound loudly, so loud I could hear it reverberating in my ears. I wanted to get up, run, do something, but my legs seemed nailed to the floor. I could only stay there, motionless, watching as the car stopped alongside the house. The door opened. Amelia got out. She looked completely normal. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a cream-colored sweater and jeans. On her lips, she still wore a tired smile after a day out. She stretched and then opened the trunk, pulling out 2 large bags. One full of groceries from the supermarket. I could see the onion stalks and some tomatoes sticking out. The other came from a children's toy store. The logo of a smiling giraffe printed on the bag squeezed my heart. She had just bought food for dinner and a new gift. Just as she turned to head for the door, 2 police officers emerged from the shadows of the porch and blocked her way. "Mrs. Amelia Vega?" The officer's voice was grave and firm. Amelia's smile froze. She blinked, looked at the two uniformed men, and then cast a quick glance at me, still petrified on the steps. Her gaze was full of bewilderment and fear. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" The police officer didn't answer immediately. He just held up a paper in front of her. "You are being detained on suspicion of child kidnapping." Crash! The two bags fell to the ground. The carton of milk broke, and the white milk spread over the cement like an open wound. Red apples rolled across the floor. One reached my feet and stopped there, bright and silent. "Kidnapping? What? What are you saying?" Her voice trembled, rising in pitch until it cracked the air. She shook her head forcefully. Her perfectly pulled-back bun began to loosen, letting some stray strands fall. "No, that's not true. She's my friend's daughter. She travelled for work and asked me to look after her. There must be some mistake." She looked at me, with the eyes of a cornered animal, full of fear and pleading. "Mom, tell them the truth. Tell them I didn't do anything wrong. I was just looking after her for a few days. My friend is coming back soon." My heart broke. A part of me screamed that I should believe her, that I should get up and tell them it was all a horrible misunderstanding. But the coldest, most rational part knew it was all a desperate lie. The officer in command shook his head. His voice was harsh and sharp, leaving her no thread of hope. "Mrs. Miller and her husband reported their daughter, Chloe's, disappearance 2 weeks ago. They never travelled for work, and according to records, they don't even know you. There is no way they would have asked you to look after her." All hope, however minimal, crumbled within me. I remained motionless, unable to utter a word. I could only look at my daughter-in-law. Her face was pale, her lips trembled, but no sound came from them anymore. At that moment, the phone inside my coat began to vibrate strongly. In the absolute silence of the place, the buzzing sounded deafening. Trembling, I took it out of my pocket. The name Robert appeared on the screen. As if clinging to a lifeline, I answered with a shaky voice. "Mum, sorry, the meeting ran longer than expected. I called you several times, but you didn't answer. Did you want to tell me something? Is everything all right at the new house?" His voice sounded cheerful, carefree, without imagining the tragedy unfolding in what he called his new home. That innocence was like a stab in the chest. I took a deep breath, swallowing the knot in my throat, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Robert, come home right now. There is a very serious problem here." I paused, gathering all the strength I had left. "Amelia, the police have taken her away." On the other side, there was only a deadly silence, so long that for a moment I thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, I heard his voice, stunned, full of fear and disbelief. "What? What did you say? They took her away? Why?" I'm on my way. Mum, please, stay calm." The call was cut off. In front of me, they placed handcuffs on Amelia. The sound of the metal clashing was as harsh and final as a sentence. She no longer resisted. She no longer screamed. She just stood there, crying silently, with tears streaming down her pale cheeks. When the two officers put her into the patrol car, she turned to look at me one last time. In her eyes, there was no resentment, only a total emptiness, a bottomless aspiration, as if her entire world had crumbled in front of me. The car started, taking my daughter-in-law, her terrible secret, and everything I once believed to be true, slowly disappearing into the darkness of the night. 2 hours later, Robert and I were at the police station. The place was cold and desolate, lacking all human warmth. The white light of the fluorescent tubes fell onto the ivory-coloured walls, making everything look even sadder and lifeless. The smell of old papers and disinfectant hung in the air, a mixture of order and tragedy. Robert and I sat on the hard plastic seats across from the interrogation room, waiting in silence. He had arrived running after my call, still wearing his tie. His expensive suit was now wrinkled and out of place. His face, pale from shock and fear, couldn't stay still. He paced back and forth in the narrow hallway, like an animal in a cage, constantly ruffling his hair that was always perfectly styled. Every step he took echoed loudly on the tiled floor, loaded with all his helplessness and despair. A long time passed until, when the waiting had drained what little strength I had left, the door to the interrogation room opened. The officer in command came out, looked at us, and said, "Mrs. Vega has agreed to make a statement. She wants her family present. Please come in." Robert practically lunged inside. Inside, Amelia was sitting in a metal chair across from a female police officer with a kind face. Her hands were no longer handcuffed, but she looked so small and fragile, lost in that spacious and empty room. She wore the same clothes she had returned home in, that cream-coloured sweater that now seemed out of place. Robert ran toward his wife, trying to take her hand, but another police officer gently stopped him. "Please, remain calm." The female police officer spoke to Amelia in a soft voice, as if addressing a lost child. "Could you tell us why little Chloe was in your house?" Amelia slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying so much, but they no longer showed the frantic desperation from before. Instead, there was a strange calm, a terrifying silence, like the still surface of a lake. She didn't look at the police officer. She looked directly at me, and with a trembling but clear voice, every word pierced my heart. "That child is Lily." The entire room fell into absolute silence. I only heard a buzzing in my ears. "I didn't kidnap anyone," she continued, with an absurd conviction. I just brought my daughter back home. I saw her alone in the park. She was lost. She must have been scared because I wasn't coming to pick her up." Those words, so naive and so crazy, completely shattered Robert's world. My son froze. Then he bent his head over the table, his shoulders shaking in a silent, heartbreaking cry. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something was running through me. She wasn't lying. In her world, in her mind destroyed by pain, that was the truth. Amelia had truly lost herself within her own suffering. Afterward, a therapist was invited to speak with us in another room, while Amelia was taken away. The woman had kind eyes and a warm voice. She recounted the testimony of little Chloe once the girl had calmed down at the hospital. It was the truth from the perspective of another mother, the girl's real mother. She said, 2 weeks ago, while playing alone near the park's slide, Chloe met Mrs. Amelia. She approached her, smiled, and offered her a colourful lollipop, telling her she would take her to buy a very pretty doll, prettier than the one she was holding. Chloe recounted that after finishing the lollipop, she started to feel very drowsy. When she woke up, she was already in a dark and cold room. The therapist continued with a voice full of compassion. Amelia taught her to call her mum. When Chloe cried asking for her parents, Amelia didn't scold her. She just hugged her, stroked her, and told her, "Your parents are working very far away. But don't worry. From now on, I will take care of you." The girl couldn't leave the basement, but Chloe said that Mom Amelia never hit her or hurt her. On the contrary, she bathed her, combed her hair, read her stories, and sang her lullabies every night. The way she cared for her was so sweet, so maternal, as if she were her own daughter. I listened to that with a lump in my throat. The tears I had been holding back since the afternoon began to fall uncontrollably. In my mind appeared the image of Amelia patiently brushing the hair of an unknown child, humming the same lullaby she used to sing to Lily. I felt a mixture of anger, compassion, and sadness for both girls. One who was gone forever, and another who was also almost lost in my daughter-in-law's twisted world. Robert lifted his head. His red eyes looked at me full of despair and guilt. He was no longer crying. His voice, hoarse and broken, barely came out. It was my fault. It was all my fault. Mum. He took my hand. It was ice cold. If only I had taken better care of her. If I had noticed the strange signs you told me about. If I hadn't been so obsessed with work. If I hadn't left her alone fighting against her own demon day after day, none of this would have happened. Every word of his was like a knife stabbing my chest, because I was also to blame. I thought a few months of therapy would be enough, that a new house could erase everything. We were naive, blind to a wound too big, too deep. And now, my entire family had to pay the price. The day of the trial dawned as grey as my heart. The courtroom was spacious, panelled with dark wood, with a solemn and cold air that made me feel like even my breath was freezing. Robert and I sat in the front row, reserved for the defendant's family. My son was rigid, tense as a string about to snap. His eyes, sunken and reddened from so many sleepless nights, were fixed on the door through which Amelia would soon enter. On the other side of the aisle, in the area designated for the victim's family, were the Millers, little Chloe's parents. I didn't dare look directly at them. I only managed to see out of the corner of my eye how the mother clung to her husband's arm, trembling every time the prosecutor mentioned Amelia Vega's name. Their pain was a living flame that ignited the air, also consuming the last bit of courage I had left. I was the mother of the one who had caused that suffering. I knew that guilt would accompany me until the end of my days. The side door opened. Amelia entered, escorted. My heart stopped. She was no longer the same Amelia I knew. She wore the prison uniform, too large for her fragile and emaciated body. Her black hair, once shiny and long, was now cut short, revealing a pale forehead and hollowed cheeks. There was no colour left on her face, and her eyes, those clear eyes that had moved me so much when I met her, were empty, lost somewhere in the void. She didn't look at us. To her, we no longer existed. The trial began. I listened to the firm voice of the prosecutor accusing, then that of the defense lawyer trying to explain. He showed all the medical reports, the psychological diagnoses. He spoke of the devastating trauma after Lily's death, of the deep depression that had consumed Amelia's mind. He argued that her actions were not born of malice, but of a destroyed mind, incapable of distinguishing between reality and the hallucinations she herself created. That was why she hadn't harmed Chloe. She had cared for her with the sick love of a mother who had lost her child. I squeezed Robert's hand, listening to every word, clinging to the hope of a shred of compassion, of a miracle. Finally, the judge, an older man with a severe face, began to read the sentence. His voice resonated throughout the courtroom, clear and without a single emotion. After considering all the mitigating circumstances from a psychological standpoint and the aggravating factors due to the seriousness of the crime, the court sentences the defendant, Amelia Vega, to 20 years in prison for the crime of child kidnapping. Concurrently, during her time in prison, the defendant must undergo mandatory psychiatric treatment in a specialized center until a finding of stability is issued by the medical board. The dry thud of the gavel echoed coldly on the table. Everything was over. 20 years. A definitive sentence. Robert collapsed in his seat, covering his face with his hands. A choked sob, so painful it broke the soul, burst from his chest. When the two police officers escorted Amelia past our bench, he stood up abruptly and shouted, his voice broken by tears. Amelia, forgive me. Forgive me, Amelia. I wasn't with you when you needed me most. Amelia, who until that moment had walked like a soulless machine, paused for 1 second. Just 1 second. She didn't turn around, but I saw her thin shoulders tremble slightly. She barely nodded, with an almost imperceptible gesture, and continued walking. Her small, solitary figure was lost behind the heavy wooden door. After the trial, I had to support Robert, who was almost without strength, and lead him to sit on the cold stone steps in front of the courthouse. He stayed there, motionless as a statue, with tears silently streaming down his hollowed cheeks. I let him cry, letting out all the pain and regret. A long time passed until his sobs subsided. Then I asked him in a low voice, mine also hoarse from weariness and sorrow, "Why, Robert? Why did you know nothing during those 2 weeks? Where were you?" He lifted his head and looked at me with guilt in his eyes. "I was travelling, Mum. The company had an important project, and they sent me to oversee a new branch. I only came back for 1 day that weekend, the same day I spoke with Mr. Henderson." He paused before continuing, his voice broken. "That day Mr. Henderson mentioned the lullaby to me, but I just laughed, thinking they were the ramblings of a confused old man. Amelia, she kept cooking for me, kept smiling, asking me about work. She didn't seem different, just a little quieter. I was so naive to believe that everything was fine, that she was recovering." He clenched his hands tightly. "I was only home that day, and then I left again. I didn't even go down to the basement, Mum." I looked into his eyes, feeling how pain, disappointment, and rage mixed inside me. "You were too indifferent, Robert. Too much. Your wife lost her only child, lost the ability to be a mother, and you left her alone, fighting the demon within her. The crime she committed is unforgivable, but our guilt, yours and mine, is not having seen her suffering sooner. We also pushed her, without realizing it, toward this tragedy." Every word that came out of my mouth was like a stab, not only in his heart, but also in mine. Robert didn't answer. He just remained silent as the tears fell again. Then he took my hand. His hand was cold as marble. "From now on, I won't let you feel alone like Amelia. I promise you." Months later, the last autumn leaves fell, giving way to the first cold winds of winter. Robert decided to sell the suburban house, where every corner and every step was permeated with horrible memories. He didn't want to keep anything that could remind him of that nightmare. He packed a few belongings and moved in with me to the old family home where he had grown up. My little house, after so many years of solitude, was once again filled with warmth and life. My son had changed. The promise he made to me outside the courthouse steps that day was not an empty promise. He turned down all the long work trips, even though it might affect his career. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I would hear the sound of keys in the door again, and Robert would enter, with a somewhat forced but sincere smile. One day I saw him fumbling in the kitchen, wearing my apron and holding my old recipe notebook. He was trying to prepare a New England clam chowder, the dish Amelia used to love. The result was a terribly salty soup, but seeing his clumsiness and the look of effort in his eyes, I felt a lump in my throat. We started having dinner together every day at the old table my husband had left us. We talked about unimportant things, his work, my neighbours, the weather. For the first time in many years, after living in the solitude of a widowed mother, I felt that I was no longer alone. We, mother and son, were learning to heal together. One Sunday, the rare winter sun peeked through the window. I got up early, prepared a pot of chicken soup, and baked some sweet potato biscuits. I packed them carefully in a wicker basket and told Robert I wanted to visit Amelia. He was reading the newspaper. He stopped when he heard me. A deep sadness appeared in his eyes. He nodded. "Take care, Mum. Send her my regards." He paused and continued in a hoarse voice. "And tell her I'm sorry. I don't have the courage to look her in the face." The rehabilitation centre was in a quiet rural area, far from the city noise. There was a large garden, full of flowers and trees. Amelia looked much better than I imagined. Her skin had a little more colour. Her hair, which was once short, had now grown out, and she wore it pulled back with a clip. We sat on a bench under a climbing vine of purple bougainvillea. I gave her the basket. She opened it, and upon seeing the still warm container of chicken soup, a weak but real smile appeared on her dry lips. "Mum's is always the best." We remained in silence for a long time, listening only to the murmur of the wind through the leaves. I didn't know where to start, and perhaps neither did she. Suddenly she spoke, in a voice so soft and fragile that I feared it would vanish with the air. "Mum, lately I no longer hear Lily's crying in my dreams." She stared into the void, with clear but lost eyes. Maybe the child has forgiven me." I reached out and took her hand, thin and icy, squeezing it tenderly. The mother's love within me ignited, stronger than any anger or disappointment. "Lily was never angry with you, Amelia," I told her softly. "She just wants her mum to keep living, to be at peace. She wants you to love yourself, just as you loved her." Hearing that, her eyes filled with tears. One drop fell onto the back of her hand, then another, and another. She could no longer hold back. She rested her head on my shoulder and cried inconsolably, like a lost child who finally finds her mother. I hugged her, stroking her trembling back. So we stayed, mother and daughter, crying together. Tears of pain, of regret, and finally of liberation. That afternoon, on the way back home, I asked the driver to take me to the city cemetery. I placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on Lily's small grave and lit a candle. The flame flickered, dancing in the afternoon wind, warm and alive. I knelt beside the cold tombstone, stroked my granddaughter's engraved name, and whispered, as if she were there with me. "My dear Lily, your mum has learned to forgive herself, and your dad has also learned to take care of his family instead of getting lost in work. Everything will be all right. From up there, keep watching over your mother and father, please. Grandma will always pray for you." The golden light of the sunset covered the entire cemetery like honey, dispelling the cold and sadness. A gentle breeze passed, causing the leaves of the trees to rustle softly, and amidst that sound, I seemed to hear the clear laughter of a child. For the first time since the tragedy, I felt a strange peace in my heart. From everything I have lived through, I understood that there are wounds that cannot be seen, but are deeper than any scar on the skin. Loss can make one lose oneself, and pain, if not shared, becomes a demon that devours the soul. I couldn't save my daughter-in-law from the abyss of her tragedy, but I learned to forgive. Not to forget, but to free myself and those I love. Because in the end, justice is not only in the verdict of a court, but in the way we face the truth, in how we accept, heal, and move forward, even if the heart has been broken once. The story you have just heard has changed names and places to protect the identity of those involved. We tell this not to judge, but with the hope that someone will listen and pause to reflect. How many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes, I sincerely wonder. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose silence to keep the peace? Or would you dare to face everything to reclaim your voice? I want to know your opinion, because every story can be a candle that illuminates the path for others. God always blesses, and I am sure that courage will lead us to better days. Now, on the final screen, I will leave two of the channel's most beloved stories. I am sure they will surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.